Greetings, it's time for another central bank monetary report, this time regarding the month of April 2022. And let's see how our thesis about money printing having to be exponential is keeping track now that we are in a tightening cycle with the central banks of the world. So as always, we go to the Yardeni report balance sheets, and the URL for this will be in the description box below. Scrolling down. First and foremost, a very important concept is that there are four major central banks in the world that comprise about 85% of the world's money printing. The United States is the red line, the US Federal Reserve. And as you can see, the United States has done only 8.9 trillion out of the total, is one of the four, and it's done about 1/4 of the total. So all the times that you hear about how the US Federal Reserve is printing money, therefore some worldwide price commodity like gold will go up, or there will be worldwide hyperinflation, that is wrong right off the bat for multiple reasons, but that being the primary reason. The US is not the only country in the world, and it's not even the biggest money printer. That would be Europe in terms of absolute dollars. As a percentage of the total economy, the US is very small, as we will see in a few minutes. So these are the four central banks of the world, and as you can see, they're all either flat or dropping. The United States is mostly flat at the moment, while the other three, ECB, European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, and People's Bank of China, are all deprinting. They're going backwards in printing. So what does that mean for the grand total? And the grand total is the only thing you should look at because technology is borderless and money printing is borderless. Therefore, the deflation of technology that is diffused from technological progress has to be met with a worldwide amount of money printing. Talking about one country printing money without seeing what the worldwide grand total is very inaccurate. And you can see that this has always been progressing on an exponential trend. Every time they try to stop printing money and even reverse it, like they tried to do in 2018 and 19, they're always forced to do more. And this would have happened with or without the COVID-19 crisis. But now they're deprinting again. They're going downwards again. And this shows that as per this trend line, they're already about $2 trillion behind. And the amount that they're behind by will rise greatly as this line goes downward, but the trend line keeps rising. So they're already about $2 trillion behind, and we are beginning to see corrections in the market, both the equity markets and the housing market in the United States, as well as worldwide already. And quantitative easing is not the reason for net inflation, as I've explained in many monthly videos, and we will cover later in this video as well. So what is the year-over-year growth rate? That is important. I contend, because of my atom thesis, that the year-over-year growth rate of worldwide money printing has to be 16 to 24% per year on average. So where is it shaking out to right now? This chart is exceedingly important because it tells us the year-over-year growth rate of the chart above that we just saw, and like I said, 16 to 24%. So this band around here is normal. It's usually below this band, meaning they don't print enough money. The COVID-19 crisis shot it up because there was an emergency that required excess liquidity, but that was still undoing the unnecessary tightening that was going on for about a year prior. So that didn't push the total trend line of compounded annual growth rate much higher. And even though it got to 46.3% in February of 2021, that was over a year ago. That was 14 months ago, and the year-over-year growth rate has been declining ever since. And now it's down to just 3.5% growth. So for all the talk of money printing, the amount that has been done in the last 12 months is very little. And as you can see from the cover thumbnail of this video, it has only been about 1 trillion in the last 12 months. So of the over $30 trillion that has been done since 2009, only 1 trillion has been done in the last 12 months. That is not enough. That is why the year-over-year growth rate is actually very low, 3.5%, when it should be on average in the 16 to 24% band. Yes, it has to compensate for this unusually high spike, which should have caused very high inflation at that time, and it didn't. That's a level where even I say that would cause some structural inflation. And as we'll see in this video, there actually isn't. But it didn't cause it even here because it wasn't that high for very long. And yes, it has to moderate down now, but this high peak was also needed to offset this outright reduction too far below the desired growth rate. 16 to 24% a year. That is what is needed to offset exponential technological deflation. And as we go back up here, just to get back to the proper trend line, there would have to be $5 trillion done in the next 12 months just to get to 16% growth, but they are deprinting. They're moving further and further away from that. That's why when there's a correction and an eventual recession because of insufficient money printing, they will have to catch up big time just like they did before. So you'll see other spikes because they can only keep overshooting because the central banks of the world don't really understand the connection between money printing and technological deflation. They still think they can deprint everything. And lastly, you can see these charts over here, which are the total assets of major central banks of the world in proportion to the size of their economies. Now, this is cumulative dollars of money printing, where the GDP per year is an annual metric, but it still gives you an apples to apples level of comparison between the four central banks of the world. And for all the screeching about how much the US Federal Reserve is printing, it is the joint lowest of the four, along with the People's Bank of China. The United States has printed an amount that is only 36.3% of its annual GDP. Europe has done twice as much, 66.7%. You would think Europeans are the ones who are most afraid of inflation, yet they've done twice as much as the United States. But the biggest of all is Japan. It has done 4 times as much, 134.9% of its GDP in money printing. It has called the bluff of this entire inflation specter. Now, of course, printing is borderless, so this does not cause any domestic inflation in Japan. Even the most exaggeration-prone inflation hawk in the United States, who says the US has already been in hyperinflation for the longest time, even those people don't claim that Japan has high inflation. Yet Japan has printed 4 times as much money as the US relative to the size of the domestic economy. That proves that people who make those claims don't know what's going on. They have to resort to pretending that the United States is the only country in the world, and the only country in the world that has printing money. Japan has done 4 times as much as the United States, and Europe has done 2 times as much as the United States. The United States appears to be a country that is not printing much at all, so don't listen to all that garbage you see in the news about how the Federal Reserve has printed so much money that the US is about to be in hyperinflation. The real data tells us a very different story. So how has the prediction shaken out in terms of how this decade would turn out? You can see this brief table over here. How I said on January 1st, 2020, that the 2020s decade would have $50 to $100 trillion of money printing in it, whereas the PhD economists of the world said all prior printing, the 23 trillion done in the 2010s decade, 2010 through 2019, would be undone, minus 23 trillion. They said all existing printing would be undone, and I said, no, printing has to rise exponentially, and it has to be 50 to 100 trillion. 50 trillion if it takes the form of cash sent directly to people, which is a form that it will have to take. Market forces are forcing it in that direction. And 100 trillion if they continue to do bond buying the way they do right now. However, they are going to have to give cash directly to people. That is going to be inevitable. So it's going to be 50 trillion and cash directly sent to your bank accounts and the bank accounts of all people. So out of these 2 predictions, the hyper-theoretical one from the economics establishment or mine, how are things tracking? So far, as of May 28th, 2022, 2 years and 5 months into this decade, almost a quarter of the way through the decade, we are at plus 11.2 trillion. Now remember, this is exponential. So the fact that this much has happened in the first 1/4 of the decade puts my forecast very, very well on track, because the remaining segments of the decade will have more and more because it is exponential. The Federal Reserve and other PhD economists still think printing can be reverted, which is why they're tightening right now. They are actually tightening, as we saw in the charts a few minutes ago, and they'll be forced to reverse it. It will fail just like the last 5 times it has failed, except they're tightening by more and more because they're getting further and further away from zero, further and further away from the 23 trillion of deprinting needed to undo the first 23 trillion that now the US Federal Reserve is going to tighten to the tune of $95 billion a month, and they won't get very far. There will be a major stock market crash that forces them to print more again. Yet doing the same thing and expecting a different result is what they are trying to do, even though in the real world that is often described as the definition of insanity. These PhD economists are very, very theoretical, and they don't mind making the same mistake again and again, despite the large human cost of it, because they never see the human cost. For them, it's just a very, very theoretical thing. It might as well be a video game that they have to hack in some way. So with this much money printing, the inflation that the inflation fearmongers have continued to predict in vain has not manifested. So let's go to part 2 of this video to look at exactly where inflation statistics are for this same very month. Now, longtime viewers of this channel know that I consider inflation to be higher than optimal. Not a problem, but higher than optimal, when the following 3 metrics are all above 3% each. We choose 3% for symmetry. That's the 10-year compounded annual growth rate of the US CPI, the 10-year compounded annual growth rate of the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, which prices commodities worldwide. It's arguably the most important of the three metrics here. And the 10-year US Treasury yield, which is an indication of quasi-long-term inflation. So we're going to do what we do every month and go to the official sources of each of these numbers to see where things are shaking out at. Now, first for the US CPI, we go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics webpage. That's going to be in the description box below. And we go over here to Consumer Price Index. And then among more formatting options, we choose the absolute value, and then 2-month, 3-month, 6-month, and 12-month values. Retrieve data. So to see the compound annual growth rate over 10 years, we do what we do every month, which is to take this number divided by the number exactly 10 years ago, and see what the annualized growth rate between those numbers 10 years apart was. So to do that, mathematically, we take this number, which is 289, divided by this number, which is 229, and we get this, which is 26% inflation over 10 years. Okay, 26% over 10 years. So what is it over 1 year? We take the 1/10th root of that. And I hope everyone understands the arithmetic here. X to the y power, x raised to y, 0.1. 1.0235. So to turn this into a percentage, we subtract 1, multiply by 100. 2.35%. You can even round it up to 2.4%. That is the 10-year compound annual growth rate of the US CPI. And no, the US CPI is not rigged or deliberately designed to understate inflation, as the other metrics that we talk about in this video will prove. That is the latest bogus meme that is going viral, but they all cite each other. The people who have this belief in what is frankly a flat earth belief are citing some bizarre metric that says that inflation is much higher than the CPI states because the CPI is continuously rigged to understate inflation. And these are people who actually categorize asset prices as inflation that is making people poorer, when asset price increases actually make people wealthier. So these are people who are way, way, way out of their league intellectually when they speak about inflation. So now we go to the next metric, which is the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index. Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, the link for which is in the description box below. 10-year compound annual growth rate is 1.69%. Now in the past it was negative. It has moved closer to that 3% threshold, but it's still not all the way there. It can cross 3%, but it can also fall below that. It's a very volatile metric, even at the 10-year growth rate level. But commodity prices are the purest metric of inflation because A, they are priced worldwide. You don't have the sleight of hand that people like Peter Schiff conduct, which is to say that the US Federal Reserve printing money causes the price of worldwide commodities such as gold to rise, therefore buy gold. He's acting like there's only one country in the world, which is odd given his fund's name is Euro-Pacific Capital. You would think a fund with that type of name has a greater awareness of international factors, but he apparently doesn't. So 1.69% compound annual growth rate over here. It's not 3%, but it's getting closer to 3%. Let's see what happens over here. Still some ways to go. And then we go to the third metric, which is the 10-year US Treasury rate. This is the 10-year US Treasury yield over a 5-year period. And it's still only 2.93%. It has gotten very close to 3%. It used to be extremely low, 1.53, and has risen of late to almost 3% and briefly peaking above that. But as of right now, May 15th, it is still 2.93%, below 3%. And to give you a longer term chart, this is 1980 to present. You can see how it's been in a continuous downtrend. And for most of the last 40 years, it was way higher than 3%. It was above 5% not too many years ago. It was above 7% during the 1990s. But now it is still below 3%, 2.93. And that's a very low bar, because if you understand things like the yield curve, you recognize that for the yield curve to even be in a healthy state, the longer term yields, such as 10-year and 30-year bonds, have to be well above 3%, especially since the Federal Reserve is raising the front end interest rate. And that's a different topic. But 3% is a very, very low bar. The fact that I would even put that there shows how difficult it is for there to truly be any real inflation. So then we go back to my table. So we looked at all three, the US CPI, the GSCI, and the 10-year US Treasury yield. So what are these numbers today that we just looked at? As you can verify over the prior few minutes of this video, 2.4% for the US CPI, 1.69% for the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, and 2.93 for the US Treasury yield. All three are closer to 3% than they were a few months ago, but they have not crossed 3%. And remember, inflation is a problem not when one of these crosses 3%, but when all three of these are higher than 3%. Then I'll say inflation is above the optimal level. And it's not in a danger zone, it's just higher than optimal. Right now it's lower than optimal. Yes, I said that. Right now it's lower than optimal because this is when technological progress is at its maximum and deflation is the furthest away, and people are earning everything from home equity gains to stock market gains with minimal price increases that affect the poorest people in adverse ways. But we're not even at this level yet. And all the screeching about high inflation or even hyperinflation is the most manufactured non-crisis you could think of. Nowhere else do I see otherwise intelligent people debating via anecdote. Gasoline prices are high, therefore everything is in hyperinflation. They don't look at anything that's falling in price. Or they heard somewhere that inflation is high, therefore it must be hyperinflation. I often use the humorous description that they're only quoting that because their wife's boyfriend's parole officer heard that the price of something rose. And that's a more accurate description of the situation than you may think, but because it not only describes how much hearsay is involved in this inflation narrative, but also the type of person who is prone to believing these fictions because they're innumerate and don't know how to look at data. And I put out these videos, and I don't have a huge amount of traffic here, but I've shown comprehensively that inflation is not high, and that quantitative easing does not cause inflation. Whatever little increase we are seeing is because of one thing. The United States has stopped the production of oil and natural gas through hydraulic fracturing, or greatly reduced it at the very least. This has caused world prices of oil and natural gas to rise, which emboldens a petrostate like Russia to take on aggressive actions. Remember, the last time Russia invaded Ukraine was 2014 when oil was high. Russia was quiet for 8 years because oil was inexpensive. When oil becomes expensive, Russia gets bold again and starts to invade its neighbors. And that happened because U.S. oil and natural gas hydraulic fracturing was stopped, which allowed Russia to have more money for these military adventures than they otherwise would have had, which temporarily pushes oil and natural gas prices higher still. But technology, the technonomic medium of the world, is working to destroy demand for oil and natural gas or adapt around it even faster than it ever could before, because the technonomic medium of the world is also more advanced than it was even in 2014, let alone in 1979 or 1974. So this is the factual assessment of where we are with inflation. Even on this channel, some regular commenters who otherwise would know better, they read one article about how one item rose in price, gasoline rose in price, or the price of a gallon of milk rose, and they come here screeching, I heard that something rose in price. Ah. No, people need to control themselves because the media is creating mass hysteria. And none of these inflation screechers know even the first thing about why deflation is what would really be frightening. I'll even go so far as to say, if you're against 3% inflation, you are against having home equity. And if you like deflation, you also like having negative equity in your home and your house being underwater. And we'll have videos about that too. But anyway, I hope you found this monthly update to be informative. And if you like this type of content, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel. Thank you very much for watching.